Let's look at how you can call a macro from another macro. So first of all, let's create a macro which we're going to call. Let's name it called macro. And let's put a comment down here. Now let's open and program this macro. So I'm gonna create, for example, the sub macro of an arithmetic mean, and I'm gonna name it get average, and these two arguments will pass to it. And now I'm gonna write the arithmetic mean calculating formula. Argument 1 plus argument 2 divided by 2, and in order to run it by using F8 key, we should use call sub statement. Let's move it up, and we should call get average sub macro. Pass two arguments, for example 100, 200, and now if we run it, we'll see the arithmetic mean 150 as calculated here. And one more detail, we can see the result only if we run it step by step, but if we run by using this button, we won't be able to see the result. So in order to make the result visible, we should use interface object, in particular message box here, and we should pass as a second parameter the variable where the result will be placed later. It's variable 1. And if we run now, we can see the result 150 here. Now let's save this macro and create another macro which will call this macro. So I'm gonna minimize this screen. Let's create a color macro. Name it color macro, and write a comment as well. And now let's see how we can call from this macro the sub macro which we've created recently in another macro. For that, we should access the statements and double click on macro sub statement. Now let's specify the parameters. In this case, the macro name which we're going to call is called macro, and the name of the sub macro is get average, and we should pass arguments as well. As you may remember, the sub macro of the arithmetic mean had two parameters, so I'm gonna add two variables first and then call it. So we should move this statement down and pass those two parameters, variable 1 and variable 2, comma, variable 2. Now let's save this macro and run. We can see here 150, which is definitely not the arithmetic mean of 500 and 600. This is a number which has been saved as a test result in the previous macro. Let's click OK. And now we can see these numbers. So something is wrong in the called macro. So let's go back to the called macro. The first thing we need to do when we test such a macro which contains general calling information is to block this testing operator like this. And also we should remember that these passed arguments are always string type variables, so we should convert those variables into numeric type. In order to do that, here in the function we have converters. I'm gonna use CDBL function in this case, which converts string variables into numeric. Let's double click on this function, and now let's put our string variables into this function. Like this. Let's remove it. We should save this macro. And now we can move to the color macro and run it. And as we can see here, now the arithmetic mean is calculated correctly. So when you are calling the macro from another macro, don't forget in the called macro, and the macro which is going to be called to block testing call, as well as to convert passed arguments which always are string values in such a macro into numeric values. And now let's see how you can call the function which exists in another macro so that this function can then return a certain value in the color macro. So let's create a new macro which is going to be called, let's name it called function, and let's put comment here. Now let's open this macro and let's create a function. I'm gonna create, for example, getAverage function with 2 arguments again. And I'm gonna write the arithmetic mean calculating formula a plus b divided by 2. As you may remember, these passed arguments are the string values, so we need CDBL function in order to convert these arguments into numeric values. Like this. Now let's call this function. Let's move it up, name it getAverage, and pass 2 parameters, for example 100, 200. And don't forget to give the same name to this function. And let's run it to test. And we can see calculated result 150 has been returned and variable 1. Now we should block this test calling and then save this macro. I'm gonna minimize it. And now let's create a color macro. Let's name it, for example, color function. Let's put comment as well. And now let's open and program this macro. So here in the statements, let's double click on macro function. Now we should specify parameters. The name of the macro, called function in this case. The name of the function, getAverage. And we should pass two parameters to it. For example, 500 and 600. Let's move down this function and then pass those two parameters, variable 2 and variable 3, comma, variable 3, and let's run it by using F8 key. As we can see here, the arithmetic mean has been returned by this function, and now we can use this variable 1 in other mathematical operation, as well as we can put this call directly in some expression. For example, we can add 1000 and run by using F8 key. And now we can see calculated result as 1550.